Okay, so today on the Vain Tempest podcast, we have CJ Killmer, who's a historian.
Yes, I served a total of 22 years of hard time in academia if you count my time as a student and then my time as a
All
professor. So
right, okay. So, what do you do now?
now I do this.
You do it full time, it's your job.
Yeah, it's kind of all I got at the moment. I actually have gone through a number of other kind of, day job type things over the last couple of
Mhm.
years since I left academia. But as of right now, I'm trying to make a go of just doing this. So we'll see, fingers crossed, whether it works out or
Cool.
not.
And have you been doing it for a while? Because when I was looking on your website, it only goes back to a couple of years, but then in other things, it kind of mentions podcasts like a decade ago. So, were you doing this a long time ago, and then you've kind of just rebooted it or something?
Yes, sort of. So I started the Dangerous History podcast 10 years ago, all the
Uh-huh.
way back in 2014. And I did it as just sort of a side project for a long time. And then, I stepped away from academia to try to do this full time in 2022. The initial attempt didn't work out as planned. So I had to take on a few other jobs. And then more recently, due to a variety of circumstances, I decided to try and make another go of doing this as my main gig. But yeah, I've been history podcasting since 2014. And the reason that I don't have 10 years of stuff out there is that I've moved a lot of my older episodes behind my paywall
Ah,
for
okay.
supporting listeners. So yeah, it's a selection of mostly relatively recent things that are still in the public feed, although I have left up because my Woodrow Wilson series is still ongoing. I've left up the entire Woodrow Wilson series that way if somebody, tunes into a recent episode of that and wants to start all the way back from the beginning, they can. Because the
Yeah.
Woodrow Wilson series I've been working on for 5 years. I put out the first episode in that one in 2019.
Yeah, that's the one we're going to be talking about mostly today as well, because you kind of chart the history of progressivism in American politics.
Yeah, and my argument is that progressivism, this really isn't what most people think it is, including most self-identified progressives.
Mhm.
So I mean, we can get into a bit. One of the things that I sort of use both to try and understand it myself and to try and explain it to other people, and I sort of hit upon this when I was trying to explain the truth about progressivism as I understood it to college students. At least some of whom probably would have self-identified as progressive. So if I just come in, um, guns blazing to
Mhm.
obliterate their ideology, that's probably going to cause them to just, backfire effect, double down, tune out anything else I'm saying. And so I always try to come into it starting off with the idea of, look, there is with progressivism, as I believe there is with most kind of like big reform movements and ideological camps and lots of other things. There's a split between the exoteric side of progressivism and the esoteric side of progressivism. So
Right.
the exoteric level is sort of like what progressivism presents to the larger world as to what they're all about. And it's also what most kind of rank and file self-identified progressives would point to if you ask them, okay, you say you're a progressive, what do you believe? And so the exoteric side it's often kind of vague platitudes, and it's often mostly things that most decent, reasonable people wouldn't be opposed to. And it's almost sort of like a Mott and Bailey type thing. So, you ask just a random average middle class person who says they're progressive, what do you mean when you say you're progressive? And they would say something, and this, probably is the same 100 years ago or now. They would say something probably like, well, I'm for making the system less corrupt and more fair and more democratic and cleaning up corruption and standing up to big business and all these sorts of things that, most of them just sort of a la carte, it's hard to object to. Like, oh no, I'm in favor of corporate abuses not being challenged or whatever. But then when you look at the more esoteric side of things, so here I'm talking more about like the elites of progressivism, be they um, kind of intellectual elites, be they the top level politicians of progressivism, or be they the corporations and oligarchical interests that have always been behind progressivism. This is something I don't think even most progressives understand. If they did, they probably wouldn't be progressive anymore. But this idea that progressivism and big business are always like mortal enemies is just simply
Mhm.
not true. Um, Big corporate interests in America have been sponsoring progressivism in a variety of ways for well over 100 years. I mean, going all the way back to like the House of Morgan and the Rockefeller Empire, people
Mm.
like that. The very people that if you haven't looked into it deeply, you would assume like, oh, these people are just going to be absolute mortal enemies of progressivism, trying to crush
Because
it at all
wasn't
opportunities.
Roosevelt kind of was against the what he called the robber barons, which are just the people you're talking about there.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, a lot of the things he did were serving a lot of those people's interests, and he also was getting his political career supported and sponsored by some of those people. Now, there's always been factionalism within progressivism and also within the American sort of power elite, highest levels of kind of corporate oligarchical power. There's always factions, and so it's never like they're all on the same page. But very few people understand, for example, that one of Teddy Roosevelt's biggest sort of boosters and sponsors of his campaigns and his political career, and also a major informal advisor to him while he was president. This is just one example that illustrates the point. Was a guy named George W. Perkins. Now, George W. Perkins, people who haven't spent years and years and years nerding out on this stuff like I have, never heard of this guy. They probably heard of J.P. Morgan. And George W. Perkins was a literal business partner of JP Morgan. He was a JP Morgan partner, but he was also a big time progressive. And he was instrumental in helping Teddy Roosevelt get the vice presidential spot in 1900 as McKinley's running mate. And therefore, thanks to an assassin's bullet, becoming president. And then George W. Perkins remained one of his main informal advisors. And people who've studied administrations of American presidents know that a lot of the time, informal advisors have more kind of pull with presidents than like their cabinet secretaries. Because if you're the Secretary of War, as they would have called it back then, like you're running a whole big bureaucracy and dealing with all sorts of stuff constantly. And yeah, you're in cabinet meetings with the president and you're having private meetings with him and whatever. But at the same time, if you're just sort of an informal, friendly advisor, like you've got way more
Mhm.
kind of face time with the president. So George W. Perkins was a key sponsor of Teddy Roosevelt's political rise. And then in 1912, when Teddy Roosevelt came back out of retirement, tried to get the Republican nomination, failed to do that. George W. Perkins was um, the main guy in creating the third party, Progressive Party or Bull Moose Party,
Mhm.
for Teddy Rose. So it's money from J.P. Morgan's one of J.P. Morgan's business partners, and it's actually funding the Progressive Party. I don't think
Yeah.
99% of people who are even fairly well read on this stuff understand this, and so it's like. The notion that you're told like, oh, the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party, it was a purely grassroots, kind of thing of these independent-minded reformers trying to, clean up the system or whatever. It's like, why is JP Morgan's business partner like one of the main guys bankrolling this? And even today, look at how often Wall Street funds progressive politicians and causes and things. Look at how often, some of the biggest corporations in the US and in the world fund progressive
So there's a
movements and causes.
question there about whether they're actual true believers or they're just strategizing. Or but
Yeah.
it's a cross party thing as well because Roosevelt was a Republican and Wilson was a Democrat. Yeah.
Yep.
So it's a bit
Yeah,
like
yeah. There
neocons. They abide everywhere.
Yeah, yeah, and they might, sometimes be a little bit different in the details and certainly in the rhetoric. So, Teddy Roosevelt's rhetoric is much more kind of, for lack of a better term, right-wing sounding a lot of the times, where he's like very like openly a war hawk and, speaks in this very kind of masculine, aggressive language. And then Woodrow Wilson is going to speak in a more, I mean, first off, he's an academic. He's the only American president we've had who had a PhD. And just in general, he's going to speak in these more peaceful sounding sorts of terms. and very
Hmm.
not sounding like a war hawk. And yet when push comes to shove, he's a liberal interventionist, which sometimes is even
Yeah.
more aggressive.
And just the things
um
that I've just on your podcast, you were reading out some kind of snippets from him. He kind of is a fan of the word salad, a bit like Kamala, isn't he?
mm. Oh yeah, yeah,
Using lots
Woodrow
of words,
Wilson.
but actually saying nothing at all.
For sure, for sure. And yeah, and one of the things I did a few years back as part of the Woodrow Wilson series, I did a huge um standalone, or a huge episode within that series, all about excuse me, his writings as an academic, because very few people really delve deeply into those. Even a lot of the major Wilson biographers seem to have only taken a glance at a little bit of his academic work. And to me, it's like, well, he's the only US president we have who was an academic for 30 years and had a PhD in political science and was writing and speaking and teaching about political ideas for 3 decades before he ever ran for any office. And so we've got this window into, like,
Mhm.
presumably what he really believes, because all of his academic work, he was not intending to be running for office. At least, maybe a little bit towards the end was thinking about it. But so presumably that's all like what he really thinks. Whereas if you just look at his campaign speeches, it's like, well, he's trying to get votes and get elected. So you have to take it with a grain of salt. Um, but yeah, when you dig into what he really thought and his real ideas, I mean, he has this whole concept of what he calls modern democracy, which I've dug into a few times on my podcast in different places, and I'm going to return to it probably within the next few weeks. I'm going to be doing a couple of episodes on the whole idea that modern democracy um, is really just what I call it is, I say, it's oligarchy with extra steps.
Mhm.
It's functionally it's oligarchy, but it's got this veneer of democracy to, like, give average people something to look at, a
Yeah.
spectacle, of elections and debates.
But just because we might have kind of jumped ahead a bit for listeners, can we
Oh, sure.
go back to kind of basics and go, what is progressivism? Is it something particular to the American political scene? What is it? What does it present?
Yeah, yeah. So I would say it's a sort of uniquely American mixture of ideas that come together, and it's got some similarities to maybe something like Fabianism in British history, and some types of like social democracy type movements and parties on the European continent as well. But it's sort of its own thing. So one big ingredient of progressivism that I think makes it a little bit different from some other similar ideologies, let's say in Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century, is a big influence of a particular flavor of Protestant Christianity. And it's what's known as pietist, evangelical pietism.
Right.
And it sort of blows up and becomes a major force in American Christianity um, not long before the American Civil War. So a lot of it kind of springs out of something called the Second Great Awakening, which took place. It's hard to say exactly, but roughly in the couple decades preceding the American Civil War. You have this religious revival movement, and a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is pietist. And so the pietist, oh, excuse me, I'm knocking my laptop around. The pietist interpretation of Christianity, and a lot of it leaned on this idea that I don't think is very common amongst Christians today, but sort of was kind of big at the time, of postmillennialism. And postmillennialists believed that human beings first had to create themselves what they called a kingdom of God on earth, which is sort of like a sort of utopian idea of
Mhm.
like a just society. And that only once human beings had done that themselves here on earth would the second coming occur. And so that then starts encouraging people who believe this and they also believe, the pietists, they believe that at least in principle, everybody can and should be saved, religiously speaking,
Right.
and that it's their job to sort of create this kingdom of God on earth to enable the second coming to occur. And so these people who believe this then get into a variety of reform movements, some of which we might, from today's perspective, find totally positive, like abolitionism, of slavery and things like that. And then other things that are a little bit more controversial, things like there was a strong kind of anti-Catholic um, streak in a lot
Mm-hmm.
of this pietist Protestantism, and so there were a lot of things about um, instituting laws that sort of favored Protestant churches in America over Catholic churches, um, things like that. A lot of people don't know that when public schools were first being set up in the U.S., they were being done on a state by state basis. And in a lot of cases, early on, there were laws that would not be allowed to stand today. Like in some states, there were laws saying you could not be a public school teacher if you were a Catholic or anything other than
Mm-hmm.
a Protestant church member. And in schools, they read the Protestant translations of the Bible in school. They sang Protestant hymns in school. And
So, because
so,
it, it
go ahead.
reminded me a lot as I was listening through your podcasts that there was a lot of resemblance to Marxist Leninism and dialectical materialism, but it's not material at all. Like you're saying now, it has a theological, so it's dialectical, but it's not materialist.
Yeah, yeah. And it's amazing how many leading progressive political and intellectual leaders of, say, the early 20th century, um, many of them were explicitly deeply religious, including Woodrow
Mm-hmm.
Wilson. And a very common thing when you look into a lot of them is very often like their father was some sort of a pietist Protestant pastor or
Mm-hmm.
minister. And so Woodrow Wilson's father was a Presbyterian minister. I believe John Dewey's father was also some kind of a pietistic sort of a preacher. And so there's this religious kind of messianic idea, and it leads people to want to seek endless reforms at home in the name of creating this kingdom of God on earth. And then eventually it's going to cause some of them to look abroad and say, well, we also have to spread our wonderful ideas and our enlightened notions about modern democracy around
Mm-hmm.
the world. So pietism is a big ingredient that I think makes American progressivism a little bit different from some of the European
Mm-hmm.
things that are kind of similar. But then also a huge influence as well is um, German ideas, in particular German historicism. So yeah, bringing up dialectical materialism, like a huge influence on a lot of progressives, whether they all realize it or not, are the writings of people like Hegel.
Mm-hmm.
And they on the esoteric side of progressivism, there's very much a teleological view of history. So somebody like Woodrow Wilson, not saying every progressive really thinks about these things or thinks them through, but a lot of
But
the leaders
he was an academic,
like
so he's going to be up to his neck in this kind of stuff. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So he would have definitely been into this and very much believed that it's sort of reminiscent of like the neocons, famously Francis Fukuyama with the end of history, where he's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, we can figure out the end point of history. Everything is leading up to, coincidentally, the exact system we have and that we're trying to spread by force. And so Wilson and a lot of progressive intellectuals, they believed that every single society on Earth was evolving down the same path towards the same endpoint of history, what they called modern democracy. Now, they believe that not every society on earth was equally down that path, far from it. So, and there was a strong WASP predisposition and prejudice on the part of leading progressives. They were overwhelmingly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and really they were primarily upper middle class or higher.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't even like they were poor white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Um, so they very much had this idea that the United States and the British Empire were the two most advanced uh, societies on Earth in terms of going down this path towards modern democracy, and that other parts of the world are varying levels behind that. So, other parts of Europe, some of them were more advanced than others, and then of course Europe overall was much more advanced than the non-European world, other than North America. Um, and they had this whole kind of teleological idea. And so they believed they were on the right side of history, quite literally, and that therefore this is what makes them progressives being hyper moralistic is not a new thing. They've always been moralistic more than anything else. They'll sometimes use pragmatic language when they're trying to, sell a particular policy or convince a
Hmm.
particular audience. But everything always comes down to moralism. And so imagine if you believe, let's say you're Woodrow Wilson and you believe that all the various reforms and things that you're trying to push as president, you believe you're literally doing God's work.
Yeah.
You're literally helping to bring about the end of history in a positive sense. And so that means when someone is like, I don't know, let's say some congressmen are in the way of something you're trying to pass or whatever, you're not just going to see it as, oh, these are people who represent certain constituencies that don't want that. These are people who just have different, priorities and ideology than I do. Maybe we can work out a compromise, whatever. Instead, it's very much Manichaean. It's very much, you are standing in the way of historical progress with a capital P. And so everything becomes very black and white. It's interesting how modern day progressives often they'll sort of masquerade as relativists, but they're not. They're only relativistic when they're trying to defend, some lifestyle or ideology or whatever that the vast
Hmm.
majority of regular people would find abhorrent. Then suddenly they're relativistic. But when they're dealing with their enemies and their opponents, they're not relativistic at all. They're extremely
Yeah.
Manichaean, extremely us versus them, black and white.
And this modern democracy, it depends on where everybody's in agreement. Basically, the whole of society is in agreement somehow, and then the government becomes the tool of that state to then just, how would you describe it?
Yeah, well, the government is the necessary tool for bringing about the kingdom of God on earth.
Yeah,
So
it's not led by the people for the people.
yeah, progressivism in terms of its origins, it's very much a top-down thing. If you look
Mm-hmm.
at like where a lot of the ideas came from, a lot of them came ultimately from German universities. So around the 1880s, somewhere around there is when PhDs became a thing,
Mm-hmm.
PhD degrees. And most of the earliest universities to even have PhD programs were German universities. And the German universities, they were ideologically just stuffed full of this sort of Hegelian ideas about the growth of state power being a good and inevitable thing that's progressing history in a positive way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you were an American and you wanted to get a PhD degree, for quite a while, you had to go study in Europe. And you would be inculcated with these ideas, and then you would come back and you would get a job at an Ivy League university or a place like Johns Hopkins, which was explicitly set up as a copy of a German university in the US. As by the way, Wilson never studied in Germany, but he got his PhD at Johns Hopkins University, and his main professors were a bunch of professors with German PhDs. Those are the guys that taught him economics and political science and what
Mm-hmm.
have you. So, so you take this sort of German idealism Hegelian kind of idea of teleological history in which the growth of state power is sort of the positive driving force behind this positive evolution of collectivism. It's interesting when you read Wilson's political science writings, he almost never speaks about the state in honest, direct terms. He almost never is like, yes, it's an organization with a monopoly on the legal right to initiate force. He usually speaks of it in these very kind of vague, fuzzy, positive terms, right? Like the state is the indispensable organ of society, these sorts of things. And so if you believe that the state is really just society's kind of, collective will, then someone who dissents, someone who doesn't want to go along with whatever it is you want to do, again, it gets very moralistic very fast. It's
Mm-hmm.
not just, oh, this person has a different take. This person, maybe we haven't done a good enough job persuading this person that this is the way to go, whatever. Instead, it's very much, yeah, you're kind of standing in the way of
What
progress.
was responsible for the rise of this?
So I think it was the influx of these ideas into American universities, and then they're being taught, to the next generation of American elites, combined with the influence of pietist Christianity. And then I think there was some legitimate kind of grassroots movements for certain things, particularly a lot of like local issues and reforms. Like I think, for example, in a lot of the big cities, progressivism got behind kind of nuts and bolts, down to earth reforms about, oh, let's, clean up the slums or, have a better run fire department or whatever it is like that. That, those things might have been political issues anyway, but because you have these pietistic ideas and Hegelian ideas amongst the
Mhm.
elites, then they kind of come in as the leadership of this movement that sort of starts with local reforms and some of which may be good ideas, and then kind of puts it under this bigger umbrella
Mhm.
of modern democracy. And so yeah, it kind of reminds me a little bit of democratic centralism, right, in the communist tradition, where it's like we allow debate, but only up to a certain point. And once we reach the point where the political leadership has made their decision, then no more debate or questioning should be allowed.
Mhm.
And you see this in American progressivism, what I call progressivism version 1.0, which is what I think of the progressivism of 100 plus
But
years ago.
Thomas Sowell says that they started calling themselves liberals.
That comes in, as far as I can tell, that really starts to come in a big way in the 1930s.
They've come back full circle now, and they're quite
Oh
proud
yeah.
of the term. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, yeah. So by about 1920, the American voters were mostly sick of progressivism.
Mm.
By 1920, they had been governed mostly by progressives for 20 years. And variety of reforms, some of which people liked and some of which people didn't. And then what really, I think, alienated a lot of people from progressivism around 1920 was the experience of World War One and its aftermath. So, the progressives get America into World War One with all of this messianic language about saving democracy and making the world safe for democracy, war to end all wars, all this stuff.
It's
And
really quite strange just how redolent it is from
oh,
today, isn't it?
yeah, there's more continuity than change in a lot of ways, even though
Hmm.
certain things are very different, like the progressives' views on things like, race and gender and sexuality are very different from 100 years ago. But yeah, a lot of the big picture sorts of things for sure. And then in fighting World War One, the government did a whole bunch of things. I mean, as far as I can tell, the vast majority of American people were never 100% sold on World War One, on the U.S. should be in that war and it's a good thing. And so, because of that, there was a lot of authoritarianism at home. There was military conscription. Most of the Americans who fought in World War One were drafted, they were not volunteers.
Hmm.
And there was massive censorship and policing of public opinion. People were being thrown in prison for saying or writing things the government didn't like during World War One. All this very authoritarian stuff while you're supposedly fighting to save freedom and democracy.
Hmm.
And there was a lot of negative economic fallout that came in the aftermath of World War One, inflation, a nasty economic crash that happened in the aftermath of the war in the U.S. So even though the U.S. didn't have anywhere near the level of carnage and destruction that the major European powers did because of World War One, it still turned a lot of people off, let's say, by the end of it. And so Warren Harding got elected by a pretty big landslide in 1920 as president. And Warren Harding basically ran as I'm the anti-progressive. He promised a return to normalcy was his famous catchphrase. And,
Mm.
what he really seems to have been coding when you actually read more of that speech and more of those other speeches he gave that got him elected in 1920, he's basically saying, aren't you tired of the government constantly interfering in your life and intervening in everything and telling you what to do with your business and, policing your free speech and whatever? Hey, vote for me and let's just kind of like take a break from that, you know?
Okay.
And so because of that, in the 1920s, progressive was no longer like a good word in the eyes of a lot of American voters. And yeah, that seems to have been roughly when um, I think John Dewey was one of the first progressive intellectuals to start making this argument of like, we're the new liberals. Yeah, there was the old liberals, what today we would call the classical liberals. And yeah, they were for relatively laissez-faire economic policies and limited government and all these sorts of things. But one of the things that's always part of the progressive story is this idea that as times change, everything needs to change. And so they would say, well, yeah, if you were back in 1800, um, the liberalism of back then was the best, thing to be because that was the most advanced kind of political ideology around. But now times have changed, everything's different. We're, a
So we
modern
need to be
society.
you need to be unburdened by what has been.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So,
Exactly. Very good.
I mean, am I just imagining the kind of similarities now between Kamala Harris and the Democrats? I mean, I'm beginning to understand Eric Kaufman, who I interviewed a few weeks ago. His book in the States is called The Third Awakening. And you've
Mm-hmm.
just introduced me to what the second
Yeah.
awakening. I understand why it's called that now.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny, the um over the course of the 20th century, the explicit religious language starts to fade away from progressivism. You still see it popping up occasionally in some of the speeches and things of, let's say, Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. It's
Mhm.
no longer as gripping with religious language as Wilson's progressivism. It still pops up occasionally. You can still find speeches of FDR where he's, making allusions to Christian sort of motifs and whatever. Um, but it's gradually going towards the background of much of mainstream progressivism. But it never really goes away. It's like explicit references to God and Christianity and Christian language fade away. But this pietistic idea of we are trying to bring about, they wouldn't call it a utopia, but that's sort of what it amounts to, that we're just, a few more reforms and pieces of legislation and a few more big government programs away from utopia. If we could just pass a few more, laws and taxes and regulations and whatever, we'll have a just society. You never quite get there because somehow they keep getting most of what they want, and then society doesn't turn into a utopia. Very often things get worse in some
Mm.
ways. And so it's this just perpetual motion machine in a lot of ways. But the kind of religious mindset, sort of like what you were mentioning a little while back with, how a lot of people, I think, with justification have said that communism is essentially like Christian eschatology with Christ and explicitly supernatural stuff dropped out, and in its
Mhm.
place is this idea of historical progress and revolution and whatever. And
Yeah.
progressivism is sort of the same type of deal, where even when the explicitly religious stuff fades away, the religious kind of attitude and mindset is still there. And yeah, I would definitely say that the woke stuff, I mean, I don't know what else to call it other than a culty religion
Yeah.
when you get
Yeah.
down to it. I mean, it's if you just listed the attributes of religion, of a religion,
Mm.
it's got its saints, it's got its heroes, it's got its devils, it's got concepts of original sin.
Mhm.
The original sin of being white and
Yeah.
male, which
Yeah.
I'm afflicted with. Um, Still waiting to get my privilege check in the mail. It hasn't shown up yet, but
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, I hypothesize that we have a space in our brain that comes from our capacity for symbolic thought, which gives birth to art. And that's where theology emerges from. And it can be filled with anything,
yeah,
including a political doctrine. And they all start
yeah.
resembling one another. Yeah. You can take away the actual ideology, but you can't take away the module in the head. It has to be filled with something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it seems like that here in the States, that the less conventionally religious a person is, the more likely they are to treat politics as religion, as
Yes.
being
Yes,
purely
definitely.
a moralistic battleground. It might as well be Zoroastrianism or something,
Mm.
as far as
Yeah.
this very Manichaean idea,
Yeah, after a kind of religious zealot, the second most zealous person you're going to meet is an atheist.
for sure.
So, who were the people standing against this movement? Who were they?
Well, a lot of it was just ordinary middle and working class Americans.
Grassroots, yeah, a bit like today again.
Another thing that kind of helps me to wrap my head around progressivism is to contrast it with populism, which was
Mm.
another kind of American political movement that had some of the same sorts of roots. It had some roots in pietism as well. Um, but one of the biggest differences to to differentiate populism and progressivism, as far as I can tell, is that the populists, and they had a lot of overlap on specific like reforms and things they wanted, but they often approached them from kind of a different perspective. And the populists seem to have genuinely believed in democracy in the sense that most people mean when they use democracy. Like they actually believe like the government should the politicians running the government should try to get an idea of what the majority of average people want and then do their best to try and deliver that.
Mm.
So it's much more what most people think of when they think of what democracy is supposed to be. Whereas the progressives, um, they were never very comfortable. Like I said, they were in terms of the leadership of the movement, it's overwhelmingly fairly affluent or even elite people. And at a time when only a tiny percentage of Americans went to any sort of university or college at all, it's very common for progressives to be, Ivy League educated and maybe even have a PhD or whatever. And so there's always been this elitism
Mm.
amongst progressives. And they say they believe in democracy, but it's a very paternalistic idea of democracy. The progressive view is the truly democratic thing to do is not to go ask a bunch of random blue collar guys what they want and try and deliver that to them. No, 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 no. The true democratic thing to do is to do what we, the enlightened, you know, educated elites,
Hmm.
we know what's best for the common man. We know what's best for his interests. It may not be what he's asking for, but it's our job to give them what we know is best for them, even if it's not at all what they're asking for. It's very paternalistic. And
Yeah.
one place where you can see it really clearly is in alcohol prohibition, which doesn't often get connected in people's minds to progressivism. But alcohol prohibitionism and progressivism were very closely intertwined. The Venn diagram of prohibitionism and progressivism overlaps a lot.
Mm.
And if you were to go into and a lot of alcohol prohibitionism was sold on kind of ethnic bigotry. It was sort of like, hey, we got all these swarthy immigrants coming in and populating the slums, and look, they're all a bunch of drunks. And the implication is sort of like, yeah, we upper class wasps, we can handle having liquor around, but these people, they kind of can't. Now if you actually went into a working class immigrant neighborhood in like 1900 and started asking around, these German and Italian and Irish and Jewish immigrants and whatever. Hey, do you want us to ban alcohol so that when you finish working 12 hours in a factory, you can't relax with a couple beers or whatever? They're going to punch you in the face, or at the very least, they're going to tell you to go to hell.
Mm.
Um, so you can't just go ask those people, hey, do you want us to ban your liquor? It's like, no, no, no. They don't know what the right thing is. I mean, first off, half of them are heathens anyway. But, they're not enlightened. They didn't go to Princeton like I did. They don't know that their neighborhoods and their lives would be better if alcohol wasn't around. So we need to propagandize them into going along with alcohol prohibitionism, even though it's not what most of them would have wanted if you actually just went and asked them. And I think this is really why the progressive establishment, and I do believe that progressivism has been the default ideology of the American establishment since at least 1912.
Hmm.
And I think this is why the progressive establishment really just despises Donald Trump on a visceral level. It doesn't have that much to do with specific policy issues, really. That it's really about like aesthetics and culture and elitism and whatever. And even though he's a rich billionaire, he's very much more in terms of how he communicates and who he resonates with. It's blue collar people.
Yeah. Mm.
And so I would say Donald Trump is populist. And to me, populism, for good or for bad, and it can kind of go either way, but
Hmm.
populism is like a real democratic impulse asserting itself in the face of oligarchy. Progressivism is sort of like a counterfeit of that that's designed from the perspective, let's say, of the corporations and oligarchs who often are bankrolling progressive causes and things. Progressivism is designed to kind of like divert people from wanting to go the populist route and instead support progressivism, but it's this much more like controlled top-down alternative. So I think a big part of why they hate Donald Trump so much is because he represents populism, which they see as nothing but vulgar and dangerous.
Mm.
And then they see what they're pushing as, the good form of democracy, even though a critic might say it's not really that democratic at all, because, you know, you want to have regular elections, but you want to very closely control who's actually allowed to run in those elections and who has any chance of winning those elections. And then also, another thing that comes out of the progressive movement of 100 plus years ago is the administrative state. That's really where the American administrative state comes from. This, you know, giant bureaucracy of people whose careers and power have essentially nothing to do with the results of elections, right? The fact that the vast majority of people who comprise the Department of Defense, the
Hmm.
Department of Agriculture, the Department
Not
of
elected.
whatever,
Mm.
yeah, they're career quote unquote civil servants, which, in practice means that it doesn't matter who you elect. If all of the major government departments and bureaucracies are stuffed full of progressives,
Hmm.
you can replace the president with an anti-progressive president all day long. And 99% of the people who still comprise what the government really is
Mm.
are the same people. And they're going
Yeah.
to do like what they did with Donald Trump's first term, where they're
Yeah, I
just
was just going to say,
resisting.
I think Trump found that out in his first term.
Yeah.
Yes.
And especially when you're talking about things like, that didn't only existed in small primitive forms back in Woodrow Wilson's days, but things like intelligence agencies, right? If these powerful, secretive,
Hmm.
intelligence agencies that have huge amounts of resources and power and total secrecy and virtually no accountability, even to Congress most of the time. If a president gets elected and those intelligence agencies don't like him, they can essentially overrule in practice the results of the election.
Yeah.
And to progressives, that would be okay. Because again, this paternalistic idea, this elitist idea of we know better.
Yeah, it's very different to what people heuristically think when they think of the word progressive. It just means like going forward, making things better. But then
Right.
it's like well, just or liberalism or egalitarianism, or all of these things sound really good to the reasonable person. But when you dig in, there's always this kind of element of, as you say, esoteric academics going on under it.
Yeah, yeah. It sort of reminds me of and I think every organized religion has this to some degree, but I think it's more pronounced in some than others. And in general, the organized religions that are the more likely, at least for some people, to characterize them as a cult, the more
Mm-hmm.
they're this way where there's this like when you join, I don't know, let's pick one that most people aren't going to be offended by if I point to it. Scientology.
Okay.
Okay. Um, if you go to Scientology as just a normie, not a Scientologist, and you're just like, oh, let me go to one of their events or institutions and like let's see what this is all about. Um, they're not going to hit you right out of the gate with all of the
Mm-hmm.
craziest, and L. Ron Hubbard says that the Lord Xenu put all the souls in a volcano, and that's why our theton levels are, they're not going to
Yeah.
hit you with all this crazy stuff. They're going to start off with, well, Scientology is really just about self-improvement, and it's an alternative to psychology, and it's about helping you to like be a better person and a better communicator. And wouldn't you like
Mm-hmm.
to be a more effective human? Come in and we'll do a reading with you. We'll do the e-meter. And by the time they hit you with Xenu putting souls in a volcano or whatever like that, you've already been so slowly acclimated to all the craziness that
Yeah.
it
And
makes
you've
sense.
spent
And
so
so
much money.
yeah, exactly. And so
Mm.
that's essentially, I think, what you've got going on, particularly at the elite universities in the US, is like
I see.
this
Yeah.
is why it's so effective when Matt Walsh, for example, makes his documentary, just letting the anti-racist people just give them a microphone and let them go because they start spouting off all of the esoteric stuff. Whereas, to a regular person, they'll do a Mott and Bailey thing. If you're like, well, what's diversity,
Mm-hmm.
equity, and inclusion all about? And it's like, well, it's about like, whatever, not hating people because of their race or not hating people because they're gay. Like all these decent, reasonable things that most decent people won't find a problem with. But then, what does it really mean when you dig behind to the esoteric side of
Yeah.
things, right? It's all this crazy like weird neo-Maoist stuff and showing up somewhere on time is racist. If you're a white person and you go to see a predominantly black movie, you're racist. If you don't go, you're racist. If you move into let's say you're a white person, you move into a black neighborhood, you're bad because that's gentrification.
Hmm.
Whereas if you're a white person in a neighborhood that's mostly black and you leave, that's also bad because it's white flight. It's like, all of this stuff that just to regular normal people is insane.
Hmm.
But they always sort of like have, again, it's kind of reminiscent of a cult where there's these like levels to it. And, when they're doing their job strategically, they don't expose the wrong level of teaching
Yeah.
to the wrong level of people.
So it's so they know they all know the kind of grand wizards all know, but they depend on useful idiots.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they speak differently in different venues, and that's been a thing certainly since the days of Woodrow Wilson, where um, if Woodrow Wilson's speaking to an audience that he knows is a bunch of
Mhm.
other elite progressive intellectuals, he's going to speak differently than if he's speaking to an audience of grassroots working class voters, in some city somewhere.
Mhm.
Um, they they kind of know it now. Every now and then they make a mistake and they right say the quiet part out loud, and that
Have
usually
you got an
causes
example of
a big
that?
hubbub. Well, there have been a couple of recent ones where shoot, who, oh, John Kerry, that's right. John Kerry and a few other people recently have like been really explicit, more so than they usually are, about basically saying that the First Amendment and free speech are really a problem. Uh, and,
Mhm.
and it's, in the name of democracy, we need to censor people's
Yeah.
expression more. This
Yeah.
crazy Orwellian stuff. And it's been interesting to watch because I think a generation ago that would have been huge to have leading Democratic Party politicians, including a former Democratic presidential candidate and
Mhm.
Secretary of State like Kerry, explicitly. Now they might have all wanted to eliminate the First Amendment or nullify it and be able to censor whoever they want. Yeah, I'm sure they all wanted to since forever,
Mhm.
but to actually openly say it, I think 20 years ago it would have been huge.
Yeah.
Whereas today, at least half the country has been, again, like with the Scientology example, they've been so gradually habituated to like now you can say explicitly authoritarian things and half the country will actively cheer it on and believe they're cheering on freedom and democracy.
Yeah. Are you aware of Derek Bell, the creator of critical race theory? Was he a progressive? Because I mean, he's a materialist, but
No.
he was from the beginning taking aim at the Constitution. I'm just kind of thinking how progressivism fits in with all of the other ideologies that are coming in the 20th century. Like Marxism and the Frankfurt School and
Right.
postmodernism. How do they all mash together, and how has it come to the ascendancy again?
Well, I think that a lot of the intellectuals that are behind those ideas, I think a lot of them are true believers. Now, there's the race hustler people that are in like the Matt Walsh movie, where a lot of them I think are just opportunistic. And hey, if you want to pay me 20 grand to cure you of your white supremacy, okay, fine. I think when you look at, there's sort of levels to it. Like there's why do certain intellectuals have certain ideas? And then there's the question of like, why do certain ideas sort of get signal boosted at certain points in time? And a lot of that has to do with money and resources. So, and where's that coming from? Well, it's coming from the state, and it's coming from corporations, especially corporate foundations have always been a huge source of kind of ideological leverage in America. And so, whether it's the Rockefeller Foundation, whether it's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation more recently, or other older ones like the Ford
But
Foundation.
they're definitely
Um,
progressives, aren't they? Bill and Melinda Gates, yeah.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And you look at like it's very simple things that most people are just not going to spot or notice or know to look for. Like if a big corporate foundation with hundreds of millions of dollars at its disposal suddenly decides we're going to start sponsoring scholars who are, pushing the DEI stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to fund conferences for those people, and they're going to, whatever, endow chairs for them at elite universities. They're going to fund academic journals for those people. Oh, and they're going to make sure that those people dominate, in particular, the education departments of
Hmm.
higher education. Because if you can like stick wokeism in all the education departments in major American universities, then people who are going to be the teachers and principals and whatever of schools for the next couple generations, you're indoctrinating them.
Hmm.
Um, and so when we're looking at like why do certain corporate interests decide to bankroll these ideas, I think from their perspective, um, from the top, I'm saying, like not even the leading kind of academics who might be administering, let's say, corporate foundation money, but the people who really own it. I think they find certain ideas useful. So I don't think that Wall Street, for example, when Pride Month rolls around and JP Morgan Chase headquarters is like covered in rainbow flags.
Hmm.
I don't necessarily think that the heads of major Wall Street banks are sitting around really believing all the wokeism. I think they find it useful. It is a very low cost, almost free way for them to virtue signal and to distract from I think often that race and more recently the sex and gender stuff. Um, the reason why oligarchical elites like to push that stuff is essentially as a divide and conquer
Yeah,
strategy, a
yeah.
divide and rule strategy.
Hmm.
And so by getting, let's say, middle and lower class white and black people to go at each other and see each other as the enemy, they're no longer looking up. They're no longer
Hmm.
looking at Wall Street and whoever else and saying, "Oh, those powerful oligarchs up there are basically kind of screwing us all over, white
Absolutely,
or
yeah.
black down here in the cheap seats."
And that would be
And
another reason
so,
why they hate Trump, because actually black men are starting to wake up to that as well.
yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a long tradition in American history of elites using race to distract from class conflict.
Hmm.
And I think it goes all the way back to Bacon's Rebellion in 17th century Virginia, believe it or not, where there was a significant rebellion in colonial Virginia when the colony was less than a century old. And it was largely driven by class conflict. It was driven by sort of everybody against the elites, the guys who owned all the biggest plantations and controlled all the resources and controlled the colonial government. And so against them was a very hodgepodge alliance, everything from indentured servants and even in some cases slaves, but also just sort of like, newcomers to the colony who were not part of the old boys network and were constantly getting screwed over and maybe
Right,
weren't even
yeah.
really poor, but they were just being, kind of left out of the club. And so there's this big rebellion, and after it gets put down, and there were things that were terrifying to the elites in that rebellion. Like there were instances of lower class black and white Virginians sort of teaming up and
Hmm.
realizing like, oh, we've got common grievances and common enemies. And let's hey, I'm a white indentured servant, you're a black slave, but we're both pretty much being screwed over by the same rich guy over there, right? And so what you see in the aftermath of Bacon's rebellion in Virginia is that it's when Virginia and then other colonies around it too, it's when they start to turn increasingly away from indentured servants, white indentured servants as their main labor source, and more towards black slaves. And then it's also when they start instituting much more in the way of laws and things to separate poor whites from blacks, like
Wow.
making it trying to remember all I did a little episode on this a long time ago, but things like you get in bigger trouble, let's say, if you're involved in a rebellion, if you're involved in a rebellion and you're collaborating with somebody of the other race, things like that. And even just like practices on plantations, like, oh, I'm no longer going to yeah, I've got some white indentured servants and some black slaves. I'm no longer going to let them kind of like fraternize too much, live and work
Right.
side by side too much. I'm going to sort of go out of my way to be a little bit nicer to the white indentured servants and be a little worse to the black slaves. And I'm going to drive that wedge between them. And so, it's using race as a divide and rule strategy to
So
avoid
what was
class
that, the
conflict.
bacon uprising? Bacon as in ham?
Bacon's Rebellion. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
his. the ringleader was this guy named Nathaniel Bacon. So
Mm,
that's the origin of the name. But yeah, it's a 1675, I believe,
right.
Louisville,
Okay.
Virginia. Yeah, that's the earliest case I know, but there's lots of others throughout history where American oligarchs will use racial tensions. They will, and the British did the same thing in many parts of their empire. And I did an
Hmm.
episode on that a while back too. You know, spent a long time, for example, deliberately stoking hatreds between Hindus and Muslims in India. You know, and not to say that those prejudices and
They didn't
tensions didn't
exist yet and
exist,
stuff. Yeah.
but the British made it like a deliberate strategic policy of like we're going to, because if the Hindus and the Muslims are more worried about each other, they're
Hmm.
not uniting against us to send us home, right? So I think that's a lot of what's behind, like, the people pushing the wokeism are true believers at the retail level, the giant oligarchical wealth and power that's signal boosting their ideas and making them so dominant in so
Hmm.
many places. And the same thing when you look at like why wokeism is so dominant at a company like Disney.
Yeah.
Same sort of dynamic. Like the mid and low level people at Disney, they probably really believe in a lot of this ideology, but I don't believe the oligarchs behind Disney are true believers in this stuff. I don't think they really care about what pronouns you use or whatever like that, but
No.
it's a useful thing. It's a useful
Yeah.
tool for them.
But they're, like you say, dividing the fan community by taking really well loved franchises and completely destroying them.
Yeah, I mean that whole thing strikes me as a huge case of cultural appropriation and cultural imperialism
Hmm.
because they're taking, pop culture. I mean, you talk about like Star Wars and Indiana Jones and things like that's American culture. And they have taken it by, infiltrating and taking over companies like Disney that have the resources to do this. They are taking these things that were part of American sort of mainstream middle class culture and turning them into vehicles for woke propaganda.
Hmm.
And if that's not cultural imperialism and cultural appropriation, I don't know what is. I mean, I presumably they wouldn't be fans of if I was a billionaire and I bought the rights to Shaft, right? The
Yeah.
black, movie
Yeah.
character
Yeah.
Shaft. And I was like, okay, I just purchased the rights to Shaft. From now on, Shaft is going to be a blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy, and
He's
I'm
going
going
to
to
be one of the Dukes
basically,
of Hazard.
yeah, exactly. And every Shaft movie now, the entire point of it is going to be pro-white supremacy,
Hmm.
and just about
Yeah.
hating the original audience of Shaft.
Yeah.
Everybody would see that for what it was and be like, oh yeah, that's horrible, that's offensive, that's cultural appropriation, whatever. But when it's, Disney saying, oh yeah, let's take Star Wars and let's make it
Yeah.
about, um, lesbian interracial space witches or whatever, like that's not. And then let's be surprised when the people who loved what Star
Yeah.
Wars originally was are alienated and put off by this. I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah, I was doing a live stream the other day with Wick TV with two feminists. I think the theme was "Are women ruining everything for men?"
mhm.
And kind of I was like, yeah, basically, especially games and movies. And
Yeah,
their only argument was, well, you're just being crybabies, just get over it. We've been having to deal with it for years. Eventually got them to admit that it's just about revenge and spitefulness.
yeah. I did a bonus episode for my podcast supporters a while ago where I called the move where the Wokies will take over an existing, fictional
Mm-hmm.
franchise or character or whatever, and then repurpose it for their uses. I compared it to the Orange Marches in Northern Ireland, where
Mm-hmm.
it's like, you know, the um the Orange Marches always cause so much tension and often lead to actual street violence and things. And a lot of it is simply that the Orange Marchers insist upon marching through predominantly Catholic
Yeah,
neighborhoods.
yeah.
Whereas if
The point that they are
you just
invading
parade,
a space on purpose.
yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, and it's a flex, it's like going into another dog's territory and peeing on something or whatever. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's a flex. And that to me is part of what they're, and this is why they don't seem to be bothered by when one of the franchises they do this to goes down in flames. Like they're not at all bothered by
No.
Indiana Jones and the Dial of whatever losing $1 billion
Yeah.
because they don't really care about profits.
Well, if I don't know how feminism fits into this, but if it's in the progressive kind of thing, the goal of feminism is to dismantle the patriarchy, and that means dismantling all of the institutions. So the whole point would be to bankrupt the patriarchy and bankrupt these institutions and then start again in some kind of utopian, social ridiculousness.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that I see that makes the modern current version of progressivism with this strong kind of woke streak different, from progressivism back in Woodrow Wilson's day was explicitly Anglo-Saxonist racist. And a lot of the progressives were eugenicists, as I've
Mm-hmm.
covered on my show. But I think one of the things that's sort of like an influence on the modern woke iteration of progressivism is cultural Maoism. A lot of this to me looks very similar in methodology and overall just sort of approach to the Cultural Revolution in 1960s China.
Yes. So cultural Maoism, so the Cultural Revolution, and again, I mean, a lot of Kamala's rhetoric comes from Mao. They're kind of, is it the four olds? We need to get rid of all of the olds. So
Yeah,
it's not just kind of Nazism, draw
yeah.
away
When I
kind of thing. It's very very Maoist.
Yeah, yeah. When I look at the way that young people are being weaponized by oligarchs and the establishment, I mean, the Antifa sorts of people
Mm-hmm.
and whatever like that, it's very, to my eyes, reminiscent of the Maoist Cultural Revolution in China because there you had the youth being radicalized and weaponized as as a tool. In that case, by Mao Zedong, who was like literally the most powerful elite guy in the Chinese
Mm-hmm.
government, and yet he's telling youthful people that it is rebellion to do what he says. Right. And so it's this great con where they think they're rebelling against
Mm-hmm.
something and they're actually serving the interests
Yeah.
of Mao Zedong himself. And I think that's what you've got going on here
And he
where
started in the primary schools as well, didn't they? I mean, they did it in Japan before the war, has indoctrinated a whole generation of children you know, from
oh yeah.
really young age onwards. And then and then Mao did it as well in that school to the point where he was the father. Saddam did it in Iraq. He was known as Papa Saddam. So children would tell on their parents if they were whispering in the corner or something. So yeah, the state and the government become the patriarchs.
Yeah, well, you end up in this weird situation where like a young progressive in America today, they think they're the rebels. They think they literally call themselves the
I
resistance.
know.
And it's like, okay, you're espousing opinions and doing things that have the wholehearted approval of Wall Street, the CIA, the FBI,
Mm,
all of the largest entertainment and news corporations in the world. Um, I mean,
yeah,
how on earth can you be rebellious when you're just saying the things and serving the interests of like literally the most powerful people and institutions in your society? I mean, talk about just impressive propaganda sort of brainwashing that I mean I'm kind of impressed. I've been impressed a lot lately by they've pulled off more than I thought. I never thought they could have gotten Kamala Harris to be slightly ahead in the polls. I Now part of that blame I think goes to Donald Trump for running a an incompetent and incoherent campaign and dropping the ball on the debate and a bunch of other things. But even so, I mean, all you have to do is look at her entire vice presidency. Her approval rating was in the 30s.
yeah,
And then all of a sudden, when she gets the nomination, every single propaganda outlet in the country just goes all in on pushing
uh-huh.
her as this messiah figure. And I mean, the fact that she's only at like 49% or whatever shows how flawed she is, that even with all of this propaganda apparatus behind her, the
Yeah,
best they can do is just get her like right around the 50% mark in
yeah.
popularity. But still, I'm impressed because she is such a flawed
Well, it's kind of
candidate.
like here, a lot of people are just brought up to vote left, vote Labour, and they vote for a poodle in a weave if
Yeah.
that was the candidate, basically, because that's just what they do. But I don't know. They're saying he's polling a lot more like 2016 than he was in 2020. So,
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, my view is that things have been so tough over here, economically, and then you've
mhm.
got, all these different wars boiling around and no coherent
Yeah,
strategy of anything with that, just other than dumping more resources into it
yeah,
forever, like in Ukraine. Um, and the average American, I could tell you because I'm one of them, is really having a hard time just keeping their head above water financially and has been for the last several years. And so to me, it's like Donald Trump, and I've got all kinds of problems and criticisms of Trump, but at the same time, just as an alternative to what we've had the last 4 years,
mhm,
I can't believe that he's not up by 20 points. And part of that is that the entire propaganda apparatus is against him, but like he should have already
mhm.
known that that was going to be the case.
Yeah.
I just feel like he's been running a very weak campaign in terms of messaging and strategy. I don't know. Um, it seems like
Compared to what though? Compared to hers?
yeah, I think her campaign has actually been very smart from a strategic point of view because what she's been able to do, and it helps that 99% of the media is totally on her side and
Mhm,
enables her to
mhm.
do this. But what her campaign has been doing, and probably she doesn't deserve any credit for thinking this up, but the strategists behind her, they're running her as an insurgent candidate. They're running her as the change candidate, even though her party's been in power for the last
Yeah,
4 years.
yeah.
She's been vice president the last 4 years. Presumably, she's not going to change a whole lot about policy from Joe Biden. Um, and so she should be the incumbent, the status quo candidate. And yet
Yeah.
she's been running as if like she's been running as much against Joe Biden as against Donald
Mhm.
Trump almost. And Trump has sort of fallen for that. Trump has been, from what I've seen at least, he's been trying to characterize her as the change candidate. He's been saying, "Oh, she's a radical who wants to do this and that and the other." It's like, well, that's sort of true, but really what she wants to do is do more of what we've already been doing. I mean, she wants to continue down the same path but hit the gas pedal a little bit harder maybe.
Yeah.
Whereas Trump, when he was running in 2016, what appealed to so many people was him portraying himself justifiably as the outsider, as the insurgent. And I'm going to go in there and upend the apple cart and drain the swamp, and I'm the biggest change candidate around,
Mhm.
whatever. And now he's almost running as if he's the incumbent. He's sort of fallen for her, I think, fallen for her, baiting him into that. So,
Yeah.
and then he gets off on all these red herrings too, like, um, really, you're going to criticize Kamala Harris for not loving Israel enough? Like, is that really like the average American who's having a hard time putting food in their refrigerator? They're going to be like, oh yeah, that's going to get me out
Yeah.
to the
But I
polls.
mean,
Is
yeah, he's not really running on that, is he though? But I think what he's got in his, I mean, I love Trump. I just think he's hilarious and sense no threat there whatsoever compared to people like Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris. Or I
yeah,
just the evil oozing out of them. He's creating a kind of team around him, which comes up to one of your podcasts of what to expect to see in states in decline. And you said that the people running for office are going to be really old. And it's true, Biden was old and Trump is old, but Trump is building this team because he's only going to be running once of really robust young men and women who are quite amazing, I think. That was kind of be what I would be voting for.
yeah. Well, my biggest problem with Trump is I don't think he's anywhere near as dangerous of an anti-establishment person as the establishment thinks he is. Like, I wish he was as anti-establishment as they think he is.
He's a
Um,
businessman, isn't he? So
yeah,
he's always going to be pragmatic.
yeah. Well, like it irritates me, it frustrates me, maybe is the better word. It frustrates me. I feel like he still doesn't, as far as I can tell, understand what he's up against. Like I really think that. I think, for example, I don't think he still fully has his head wrapped around
Well,
just
even
how
after two
much
assassination attempts.
exactly, just how much the deep state hates him, just how much he cannot trust the Pentagon. He cannot trust the CIA. He cannot trust the FBI. But I don't think he knows that fully.
But
I
he's
mean,
not
he
really
goes out of
there.
his way.
Yeah. He's not going to be able to do everything that they want in the 4 years. I mean, I'm even have a bet with somebody that he's probably going to retire halfway through, just hand it over to whoever's his VP. But it's the people that he's going to have around him that they need to be more scared of than Trump, because Trump's not going to have time. The army that he's building around him that are going to be the thing that they have to fight in the coming years.
Well, I hope that he does, if he does make it back in, I hope that he does a better job with personnel than he did in his first term, because he sure did surround himself with a
Yeah.
lot of swampy characters in his
Yeah.
first.
Yeah. Like you say, he certainly wasn't aware of how corrupt it was.
Yeah, but to bring in somebody like John Bolton or somebody like Mike Pompeo or somebody like James Mattis
Mm-hmm.
as some of his top like military and foreign policy people. These people are adamantly opposed to everything he said he wanted to do in foreign
Yeah.
policy. He said he wanted to end a lot of these wars, reduce America's foreign commitments, whatever like that. And he surrounds himself with a bunch of like proto neocon sorts of characters. And it seems like he himself is sort of conflicted, where on the one hand he's got the instinct that I would agree with of
Mm-hmm.
America first, like let's get out of these foreign
Yeah.
entanglements and stop engaging in all these wars. And yet he also, as part of his persona, has this like, oh, I'm the tough guy sort of thing. And so that makes him susceptible to somebody like John Bolton or somebody like Mike Pompeo, um, being able to play him a bit,
Mm-hmm.
where they might not sell, I don't know, war in Syria on neocon grounds to him, but to be like, oh, Mr. President, the president of Syria said you've got small hands or whatever, and like next thing you know, Trump is launching missiles, doing the bidding of the neocons, not even realizing his narcissism. I think his narcissism makes him easily manipulated.
I don't see that narcissism. I see a normal narcissism. And I think people in those roles, all of them have to have a certain, probably a larger degree of it. But I don't see pathological and narcissism there. I see a lot of humor, really, more than anything. It's probably a lack of Machiavellianism than too much of it.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'd say there's a lack of Machiavellianism on his part in a detrimental sense, because it makes him vulnerable to being misled
Mm,
by advisors and sidekicks who don't actually agree with his policy. And again, I hope if he does make it in again that it's different this time around.
yeah. Mhm,
I hope that he makes Douglas McGregor his Secretary of State instead of somebody like Mad Dog Mattis, or
mhm,
makes I don't know, Tulsi Gabbard something important, somebody like that.
mhm,
Because yeah, I mean he came in with all these, I'm gonna basically drastically alter the course of American foreign policy, and then he mostly surrounded himself with people who did not want to do that,
mhm,
and then
yeah.
sabotaged him every step of the way and undermined him whenever he tried to. I mean, the Pentagon, lied to him. We now know the Pentagon lied to him about how many American troops were in Syria and where they were. Um, and I feel like despite all that he's been through, I still see him as kind of naive, really.
Yeah.
I don't think he fully understands what he's up against, even after everything, including two assassination attempts.
Yeah, too optimistic, you mean?
Yeah, yeah, or thinking like that the FBI is these great American heroes that
Yeah, they'll
he
come
says they
around.
are. Yeah, and that there might be a few bad apples in the FBI or a few
Mhm,
bad apples in the CIA, but that they're generally, good patriotic Americans that I can trust when
mhm.
all the evidence is to the contrary.
Yeah. So let me just go through your points here. What to expect to see in states in decline, and maybe people can comment below if they think they see these things today. So states fight more wars when in decline. We're fighting more wars certainly under the Democrats, but we don't fight more wars under Trump. So would you say we're in decline, or do you think Trump has an opportunity to turn it around, or do you think the decline is inevitable?
Um, I think some sort of decline of the American empire is inevitable just because there have been too many there have been too many bad strategic choices and too many bad economic policies
Hmm.
for too many decades. That I mean, you just pull up the national debt and just basic things like this. and this is not sustainable. And
No,
the American empire in its current form is not indefinitely sustainable. Empire never is an indefinitely sustainable
no. So do you think we're at the point
policy.
now in it where the elites and the dynasties are creating wars simply just to grab resources on the way
Yeah,
down?
I think there's a complicated mixture of reasons behind why the wars are so constant, and some of them are, yeah, that there's a lot of powerful interests that make a lot of money off these wars. These wars
Yeah.
might
Well,
cost the
war's the
American.
biggest opportunity for money laundering, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, a lot of powerful people are making a lot of money off the war in Ukraine, things like that.
Mm.
So there's their self-interest. I do think that at least some of the people that are like high up neocons and neolibs are true believers, actually do believe in this ideology of spreading democracy by force around the world. I think some of them still like it's a religion to them. They genuinely believe this nonsense.
Mhm.
Um, and then I think there's also the influence, and this is something George Washington warned about in his farewell address, that it's dangerous if foreign governments are able to kind of intervene into American domestic politics and maybe manipulate the country into getting into a war to bail some other country out that's really not in the interest of the American people.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, just look at the for a long time, the two biggest governments, as far as I'm aware, in influencing American politics, foreign governments have been the Israeli government and the Saudi government. And they do this in a variety of ways. They fund think tanks,
Mhm.
they fund politicians, they are often involved in various ways in American media companies. Certain American media companies are. It's been a while since I looked into it, but I know that there's like, for example, some American news companies that are partly owned by like a Saudi prince or something like this. And
Mhm.
um, so if that's not influence, I don't know what is. And then
Mhm.
lobbying, just good old fashioned lobbying, things like this. And for much of the last few decades, Israel has consistently been the number one foreign government that exerts influence on American politics. And then just in recent years, starting like in the last few years leading up to the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Ukrainian government actually started going nuts,
Mhm.
spending money and resources to influence American politics.
Yeah.
And I believe in the couple of years leading up to the Ukrainian war, I'm pretty sure that the Ukrainian government actually overtook Israel, at least for a little while, in terms of how much money they were spending
Wow.
to influence American politics. And so partly I think it's that. And then there's also this weird thing where a lot of the people that are in charge, a lot of this goes to the State Department too, not just the Pentagon, where um a lot of the departments of the State Department, the sort of sub departments that say deal with Russia and that part of the
Mhm.
world, they're staffed full of people from the other countries around Russia who have longstanding hatreds of Russia going back hundreds of years. So it's like the people running the parts of the State Department that are supposed to deal with Russia, it's
Mhm.
staffed full of people that are like Polish American, Lithuanian American, like all the countries that just hate Russia and have hated Russia, and sometimes with some good reason. Don't misunderstand me, but like, is that really a good thing if the parts of the State Department that are supposed to be interfacing diplomatically with Russia is
Yeah.
staffed full of Russophobe, people? And the same thing, a lot of parts of the diplomatic apparatus that are supposed to deal with the Middle East are staffed full of like hardcore pro-Israel neocons. It's like, well, they're never going to deal fairly
Mhm.
with the Muslim world or the Arab world or whatever. They're always going to have their biases.
So the next thing is increased a state in decline will increase welfare programs.
Mhm. Yeah, this
Yeah.
is a way to keep the population docile. And so the oldest example that we all think of is the bread and circuses in the Roman Empire. That
Mhm.
even as the Roman Empire was going bankrupt, they're promising citizens increasingly generous, benefits of
Mhm.
various types. Um, and you see that, in the case of the British Empire, that simultaneously with as the British Empire was falling
Mhm.
apart, they're building the welfare state at
Mhm.
home into an ever larger, more powerful thing.
Yeah.
It seems to be a common trend. which it's very much based on short-term thinking amongst the leaders, I think, where they're thinking, well, if we just keep giving people, more generous handouts, that'll keep them from going out in the streets and
Mhm.
staging a revolution or whatever. Not thinking
Yeah.
about, yeah, but we're already broke. So, this is just going to speed up the economic calamity.
Yeah. It's kind of an evolutionary theory. We call that promoting a fast life history, where
Mm,
it's live fast, die young, enjoy it while you can.
yeah.
So, right. Monetary inflation, rising prices, then
Mhm.
price controls, which is Kamala's
Yep.
policy,
Yep.
which leads to food shortages, which leads to rationing, which leads to hoarding, which leads to anti hoarding laws, and then which leads to police state authoritarianism.
Yeah, yeah. It doesn't
It's a
always,
cycle.
play out to its fullest
No, no, no.
extent,
Well, hopefully,
but
no. Yeah, there's a.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the one that I'm familiar with from a long time ago is the Roman Empire under Diocletian, where Diocletian implemented draconian price controls, and then that led to shortages, basic economics 101. And then next thing you know, he's each economic intervention leads to more economic interventions to try and deal with the negative fallout of the previous one.
Mhm,
So yeah, you get into that cycle, and it tends to get increasingly authoritarian because what do you do if it no longer is profitable for farmers to bring their goods to market, and so they're just sitting on their goods?
mhm.
Well, you can't have that, and so you just pass a law saying, oh, you can't do that, the anti-hoarding laws. And well, how are you going to know if a farmer is stashing grain in his barn? Well, you got to have anti-hoarding police that can go and search, and you know, um, in very short order, those sorts of things tend to snowball into a police state.
Yeah, I think people underestimate how easy it is to kind of for civilization to just crumble, basically.
Yeah.
But you also say that authoritarian practices on the edges of the empire start coming in to the center of it.
Yeah.
I wonder
I,
if we've seen that in England in the last few months.
yeah, I think it's been going on there for a long time.
Mm,
And here as well. I mean, it always happens when you have an empire where the government will do things out on the fringes and frontiers of the empire. Let's say it's an empire that's relatively liberal at home, right? Like
mhm.
the British Empire or the American Empire.
I'd say
Um,
Benghazi would be a good example.
yeah, yeah, yeah. They'll do things way out on the fringes that are much more authoritarian and like that. They would never do at home, but yet very often fast forward ahead a decade or two and they start doing the things at home. The saying is the empire always comes home.
Hmm.
So, even in the case of the US, this has been going on longer than people realize. More recently, we can see like every time there's a major American overseas war, there is then an uptick in the authoritarianism of the police state at home in the aftermath. So it's in the aftermath of the Vietnam War that American police really start to militarize, and
Mm,
you start to get like every city more than 100,000 people has a military style SWAT team, and police are carrying increasingly like military hardware, driving around in armored personnel carriers,
hmm.
and then again, more recently, in during and in the aftermath of the Iraqi and Afghan wars, where there's an uptick in authoritarianism at home,
Hmm.
um, and a lot of times it filters back in incrementally. So you start using drones, let's say, in another country to kill people without anything resembling due process or a trial,
Hmm.
and the American people don't really care because it's on the other side of the planet. Um, it's being
But they
done
don't
against a
realize
bunch
they
of.
don't realize it's like COVID. You're going to be wearing a mask in 2 weeks' time.
Exactly. Yeah. They don't really care if it's a bunch of swarthy Arabs getting, blown up by drones with no due process. They're like, they're probably terrorists anyway,
Or
and not
Russian
realizing,
conscripts at the minute. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, that
yeah.
too. And then it'll filter back gradually. Law enforcement will start using drones, but initially they won't be armed. They'll just be for,
Hmm. Hmm.
surveillance and
But then there'll be the
intelligence.
threat of them being armed.
Yeah. Yeah. And as with everything else, they do it so gradually and incrementally that there's not that clear shocking moment to people where
Hmm.
they go, "Oh my God, the police just killed a man with a drone." When that happens over here, it's going to happen after such a long, slow erosion to that
Hmm.
that probably at least 50% of the country is going to be cheering it on and clapping like trained
Well,
seals.
we're probably going to have to stop going out in large crowds. We're probably going to have to stop stadium sports because they're just going to be too easy a target.
Yeah, I
But the
mean,
next one, and I want to try and dig into this if you've got time. Are you not tired? Are you okay?
yeah, I'm all right.
Okay. So sex and gender obsessions. You're saying in a declining empire, for some reason, empires get really obsessed with this. Tell me about it.
Yeah, well, this is something I'm still trying to understand, to be honest with you. Um, I know that as far as I know, the person who first really kind of put this together was Camille Paglia, and I've only recently started to read a little bit into the book Sexual Persona,
Mhm.
and I still don't quite fully get it. Uh, I mean, I know that's not a satisfying answer, but it definitely seems like a pattern where empires that are in sort of decline, there's this like decadence that often happens, particularly amongst the elites. And I don't know if it's
What, sex
another
parties
symptom.
in lockdown?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Is this another symptom of the sort of like time preference change where you just sort of care about immediate gratification? The empire's burning down, so might as well have orgies today while we still can. I don't
Mm,
know. But it definitely seems like it's very common for there to be a lot of transgression against previous gender norms. And
yeah.
it tends to come from the elites. It tends to be a top-down thing. It's not like um if you're a rich Hollywood uh if you're a rich Hollywood family, I think you're way more likely to have one or more of your kids come out as transgender or, being otherkin furries or being
That was probably the
non-binary or
case, I think, a few years ago, but now because of social media, I think it's happening in everyone's house. And yeah, kids have been taught these kinds of things in primary school. So yeah, they're
right.
thinking about sexuality before puberty, before they actually understand what it is. So it's odd. It's very much a type of grooming. Um,
Yeah, and by planting that seed so early, then I mean everybody when they go through puberty struggles with kind
yeah.
of their own body and figuring themselves out and whatever. That's a completely normal thing. And now you're planting a seed before that happens of like, well, it's probably because you're born in the wrong body. And,
Yeah, yeah.
and so instead of just realizing like, oh yeah, I'm going through that awkward kind of middle school stage of puberty that everybody sort of goes through. And yeah, probably in a couple of years, I'll be fine and comfortable with who I am.
Mhm.
Instead it's like, no, there's this eternal thing wrong with you. And the only solution to it is hormone blockers and surgery.
Yeah. Okay, the next one is private sector crime increases. Now, this is something I was interested about because Steven Pinker, I think, was it Enlightenment Now? Because I emailed him at the time and said we might be seeing a decrease of crime on the streets, and I think we were then. But have you looked into private sector crime and corruption? And he went, "Oh no, that'd be very interesting." That was as far as the conversation went. But I mean, something's hitting the news every week now, certainly in the States, particularly about misappropriation of funds, unaccountability. It seems completely all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a general kind of erosion of respect for those sorts of norms.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when people low down in the social hierarchy see that everybody up at the top is clearly corrupt
Yeah.
and routinely violating, even when they're not violating the law, because after all, they write the laws, so a lot of the biggest
Mm-hmm.
corruption is totally legal. But even when they're not violating the law, it's very clear that's because they wrote the rules for themselves and gave themselves the loopholes and whatever like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that inevitably has a corrosive effect
Yeah,
on
definitely.
lower level people to be like, well, then what do I care? I'm gonna go steal something from a store. Or I'm gonna go, rob somebody. Because after all, I mean, the president's
Everybody's
nothing
doing
but
it.
a crook. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. This is
And
a general erosion of respect for
Yeah,
kind of civilization, really, in a lot of ways.
definitely. Finally, you say the narrative collapses. So where do we see that?
Uh, Empires are always built in large measure on a story, some version of our civilization and our system are the best. And therefore, not only do we have a right to spread it, we actually have an obligation and a duty to
Hmm.
spread it. And so, the Romans would have talked about like, oh, these, backwards Celts and Germans and whatever. They're going to benefit from, and again, this paternalist mindset like progressivism. They're going to benefit from Roman civilization. Now they're resisting us right now because they're not enlightened enough to see. But it's going to be for their own good because we're going to take them over. We're going to rule them more effectively than they can rule themselves.
Hmm.
And the British Empire had its narrative about, uplifting these poor, less civilized parts of the world. The Soviets had their, communistic narrative, but still this idea of we're this progressive force
Hmm.
looking to improve the world, whatever. And this justifies all of the ugly sides of imperialism and wars and things. And so yeah, the American mythology is I don't think as many people really believe it. And when the myth starts to the the government is always founded on fictions, and there's always a divergence between the fictions and reality, but the divergence can only get so big before it starts to collapse. And so when the American narrative about the American dream and freedom and democracy and anyone can make it here and all these sorts of things. When it was not that far from reality, people could easily kind of go along with it. Like, yeah, it seems things seem to be mostly working. It seems like, yeah, if you do work hard and play by the rules, you end up living a good life. And isn't this nice? But the more that people's actual, to use a wokey term, lived experience, when the divergence between people's actual lived experience is so different from what the mythological narrative
Hmm.
justifying the system says it is, people get very angry, and that tends to be ripe grounds for things like revolutions
Hmm.
when the reality gets too far away from the marketing.
Yeah. So it seems like the kind of make America great again thing is a kind of shrinking back to that achievable narrative,
Yeah, yeah, it's
not
that's
kind of prosecuting wars overseas and nation building, but just concentrating on the family, which is the American state itself.
yeah, yeah, and it's weird the way that the whole like mass illegal immigration thing plays into this, and
Mm.
I still another place where I'm impressed by the propagandists. Um, I'm shocked that this idea that it makes sense to just have completely open borders
Mm.
and to have it where like just millions of people can come in with nothing in terms of like checking who they are, figuring out if they're people that are actually will be positive for society
Mm.
to import, whatever, and then trying to make it as easy as possible for them to vote and to get welfare state benefits and all these sorts of things. I'm pretty sure the United States is the only country or one of very few countries that has birthright citizenship, where all you have to do is fall out of your mother on American soil and you're a citizen. And it doesn't matter where your parents came from, if they're in the country completely illegally, you're just automatically a full-fledged citizen with all that that entails. And
I'm
I
not
just
sure.
I can't believe that there are still a lot of regular Americans who I guess they've just bought into the Democratic Party and wokeista narrative that like if you're not in favor of completely open borders and giving everything to illegals as soon as they show up, that like you're a Nazi.
Well, it's a lot of them are, like you say, elite in their own right, upper middle class. They don't have it in their backyard.
That's
They
true.
don't. They,
Yeah.
they don't live in Springfield, Ohio, and so they just don't see it. That yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
they
They
see it in
live
the
in a gated
abstract, but they just don't see it in the real.
Right, right. Yeah, they live in a gated community in Beverly
Mm,
Hills or whatever it is, and no illegal immigrant is ever going to come within 100 yards of them in their entire life. And so, yeah, it's very easy. Just as it's easy to be brave with other people's lives and it's easy to be generous with other people's money, it's easy to say, oh, yeah, we should have open borders when it's
yeah,
mostly not going to affect you. Other than maybe there's an even bigger pool of low paid people to be your maid and your gardener and your nanny. That's
that
to them
too
it's a lot
as
of
well.
upside, I
But then that
suppose.
kind of just leaves the actual indigenous working class completely disenfranchised, doesn't it?
Yep.
So that's this progressivism. This is what we see, what we have. And you would agree that the Democratic Party now is a progressive one?
Yeah, certainly relatively more so. Now there's still the Republican Party establishment, the kind of, Mitch McConnell sort of remnants, the remnants of kind of like the Bush style Republicans, they still exist.
Mm.
And I'm still, not sure. I guess we'll see what happens. When Trump leaves the scene, whether he loses this election or whether he comes in and serves another term or whatever, either way, within a few years, he's going to be, done
Mm-hmm.
as a politician in the
Mm-hmm.
American system. And so I'll be just very interested as a spectator to see, does the Republican Party revert back to the Bush, McCain, Mitt Romney, Mitch McConnell sort of Republican Party, or does it stay permanently imprinted by Trump? I don't know. I could see it going either way, to be honest with you.
Well,
Um,
hmm. Well,
but
hopefully, sorry, carry on.
I was just going to say that I think there's always been and still is to this day a version of progressivism within the Republican Party that's represented by the establishment. And so you can see it in when Barry Goldwater got the presidential nomination in 1964 as this sort of conservative insurgent in the Republican Party. His main opponent was Nelson Rockefeller, a much more quote unquote liberal Republican, an establishment Republican. And the same thing with Ronald Reagan in 1980 getting the Republican nomination. His biggest opponent was George H.W. Bush, another one of these kind of liberal establishment Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
And they're progressive too. Now they're a different kind of progressive. They're maybe less radical, we might say, than the progressives within the Democratic Party. Maybe we would call the Republican progressives progressive light. And it seems like what their role is supposed to be is to play the role of controlled opposition, where they're allowed to be in power every few years, and this gives the voters the illusion of choice and democracy. But they're not supposed to go too far against the direction that the Democrats are pushing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, they'll talk a lot of trash, but like they're okay with a Bush being president or whatever at the end of the day, because they know that a Bush won't upend the apple cart too much.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they freaked out with Trump, because like he's not playing the
No,
role
yeah,
of
he's not.
controlled opposition,
Mm.
WWF wrestling style of I'm going to pretend to be the enemy. um, he's not really doing that, and that's what freaks them out. Because then they think he could do anything. He's a wild card. He's a loose cannon.
Yeah, yeah. So
That's what
yeah, it's
scares
not
them.
democracy that's under threat, but from
Yeah.
Trump, it's the Democrat Party and progressivism.
The way I put it is, I say when they say our democracy, what they mean is their oligarchy.
Yeah.
And so that's all you have to do is just substitute our oligarchy every time you see our democracy, and that's what they're really talking about. And I've come to the conclusion, like I said before, that modern democracy is just oligarchy with extra steps.
Cool. Right. Well, hopefully, I'm better informed now about what progressivism is. Hopefully, I'll be able to spot them. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely, been fun.